How long have people been interested in phenology, and what is the value of these historical records for the modern science of phenology? I am Paul Alabak, a scientist with Project Budburst. In this video, I will explain the history of phenology and why there is so much excitement by scientists today about the data that Project Budburst volunteers are collecting, which builds on this long tradition. Phenology is one of the oldest branches of environmental science, dating back thousands of years. Observations of phenological events have provided indications of the progress of the natural calendar when seasons begin and change since pre-agricultural times. Phenology was a key survival tool for early cultures since it could be used to determine the appropriate times to plant crops or do agricultural treatments, and was also useful for determining the best time to look for wild foods. As an example, wine producers have long realized that observations of phenology can be used to determine the influence of weather on the quality of grapes. In the Burgundy region of France, detailed records of harvest dates for grapes have been kept for over 600 years. These data provide scientists today with one of the few means of reconstructing detailed changes in the climate of Europe over this long time period. An even longer record exists for the dates of cherry blossoms in Japan. This is one of the reasons that Project Budburst started the Cherry Blossom Blitz for tracking these blooms in the United States. The flowering of dandelions is often used to indicate when early food crops such as potatoes can be planted. This relationship works because the plants flower when the soil thaws and warms to 35 to 40 degrees. So in regions in which this is the correct soil temperature for planting a particular crop, it is a very useful and easy way to know when to plant. One of the most useful ways phenology was used by hunter and gatherer cultures was in looking at the relationship between easy-to-observe plants and the arrival of animals or the availability of food plants. In some cases, such as the linkage between the arrival of birds and the availability of food sources, a change in this relationship could lead to population declines of these birds. This phenomenon is called ecological mismatch. These historical data and traditions can provide an important baseline to determine how species phenology were related to one another before modern environmental change began. In Europe, the Swedish botanist Carolus Linnaeus systematically recorded flowering times for 18 locations in Sweden over many years back in the 1700s. His meticulous notes also recorded the exact climatic conditions when flowering occurred. Linnaeus and a British landowner, Robert Marsham, share the honor of being considered the fathers of modern plant phenology. Marsham could be considered one of the first citizen scientists in modern times. He kept systematic records of indications of spring on his estate in England. For generations, Marsham's family maintained records of phenological events. The records of the Marsham family showed trends that were observed and related to long-term climate records. In the United States, several prominent early naturalists continued this tradition from Europe, including John Bartram, the father of horticulture in the United States, who maintained careful records of plants growing around his farm near Philadelphia in the late 1700s. His farm, which is now preserved as a historical site, is actively being restored and may become an important area for making modern observations with Project Budburst. Other important naturalists that kept phenological records, which are now being used by phenology scientists, include the authors Henry David Thoreau in Massachusetts, Aldo Leopold in Wisconsin, and more recently Floyd Swank in the Chicago area. The modern history of U.S. phenology continued in the 1950s with Joseph Caprio establishing the Lilac Observation Network in the western Great Plains of Montana. By the 1960s, the network of volunteers observing the first flower, full flowering, first leaf, and full leaf stages expanded to the central and eastern United States, and eventually became a national program which is now managed by the U.S. National Phenology Network. Data from this network have been used to develop mathematical models of how lilacs change their phenology in response to changes in spring or winter climatic conditions, and how these relationships can change according to geographical region or due to local factors. Scientists are now using historical records of phenology to better understand how plants respond to environmental change. For example, Abraham Miller Rushing and his colleagues have published a series of studies on what can be learned by combining historical records with modern observations, such as what volunteers are providing with Project Budburst. This study started with the realization that the carefully archived original journals of Henry David Thoreau and his notes on natural history provide a unique and detailed record of the Walden Pond area going back to the mid-1800s. Thoreau was an excellent naturalist and kept records of over 500 plant species in the area. He recorded the first date of flowering of each of these species, the phenophase we call first flower in Project Budburst. Miller Rushing and his team located examples of most of the species originally identified by Thoreau in the Walden Pond area, which is now preserved as a state park. In 2004, scientists and volunteers started recording flowering dates of plants so they can compare them with Thoreau's original observations. Many startling discoveries have emerged from these studies of the Walden Pond area. Plants are flowering an average of a week or more earlier than at any recorded period of time since the mid-1800s. Of particular interest to scientists is the additional observation that plants vary widely in their ability to change phenology as climate and the environment changes. Some species quickly change their phenology. Others still flower about the same time as in Thoreau's time. According to these studies, plants that have not changed their phenology are generally less common than those which have changed their phenology as the climate changed. This provides scientists and conservationists with important information on the relative sensitivity of plant species to climate change in the future. This could be an important way to use Project Budburst data that is being collected by volunteers today. Because of the long history of phenology observations, the observations we make today are of particular value to science. It is one of the few ways that scientists can accurately and mathematically measure how plants have adapted to environmental changes over 100 or more years. By participating in Project Budburst, you are contributing to this long-established history. You also join a legion of citizen scientists across the world and through the ages that are helping to understand changes in our environment over time. Thanks for listening. To learn more about why Project Budburst is important to science, please view the other videos.